All right, it's Lit Book Reviews. We are back at it. I am Mike Tyson, as always, your host. With me today, as always, the other host is Evander Holyfield. And today we do have a special guest with us, Roy Jones Jr. So we are excited to
We
get
gotta get his
into it.
Wi-Fi fixed. We gotta start a GoFundMe for that.
Did you lose me for a sec?
I heard that you were Mike Tyson, and that was all
All
I
right.
heard. And the lights were
Well,
out, just like
you're
Mike
Evander
Tyson does.
Holyfield.
Okay.
Nathan is Roy Jones Jr. But it should be in the.
Okay. Yeah, it'll
It
be
should
in
be in
there.
there.
We'll clip it in.
So yeah, we're back at it again, ready to do another episode of the show here. But yeah, first things first, we do have a guest, Mr. Nathan Moore. Happy to have you here with us today. Nathan, if you want, just introduce yourself, give us a little quick spiel, and tell us a little bit about your, in regards to reading, like how long you've been reading, like history, like that kind of stuff.
Thank you. I'm excited about being here this evening. My first book of history I read was by a gentleman by the name of William Manchester, called The Glory and the Dream. I was sick and at my in-laws' house, nothing to do, was bored as all in. And I took this book off the shelf and I read every page of it. It was all about Roosevelt, FDR, the new dream, America, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and it just captivated me. And really, at that point, I joined the library, right? And then started getting all of William Manchester's books, and then kind of had a connection with my dad because my dad was reading history books. So I was, goodness, 25, 26, really, quite frankly, y'all's age, right? 27.
Yeah.
And it kind of gave me something to talk about with him, which was fun, right? And so he introduced me to other
Yep.
authors, and I just really absolutely just became all different types of subjects. Obviously, so many people my age love World War II. That seems to be a theme, and to go through that. But
Yep.
American history, European history, world history, I can't get enough of it. I'm nothing special. By no means am I a scholar by any means. I just read the stuff that's all available. David McCullough, right? And Hampton Sides and Eric Larson. Those guys, I've read some of their stuff twice. And I did want to admit something, right? I want to go and get this out on the table, that I have stopped distinguishing between reading and listening to an audio tape. It just gets exhausting, right? To be able to say, well, have you really read it or have you not read it, right?
Yeah.
Got in a debate with a friend of mine on this recently. And this was my comeback to him, right? And by the way, I've done both. For many, I've read them and then listened to audio tape. We're all listening to an audio tape. It's just who is the narrator, right? That's just my comment back to him. Are you hearing your own voice or someone else's voice?
That's a fair point. That is a fair point.
So.
You hear that, Jesse? Jesse used to make
That
fun
is
of
a
me a
fair
lot
point.
because I still do. But anyway, I think Jesse is kind of coming. Was it more recently that you started? Because had you really ever done audiobooks before? I know recently he's done a couple.
No, I haven't until we started doing this, and now I still mostly physically read, but I'm on board with the audiobook. We only have so much time on our hands, and it's easy to throw in some headphones. Yeah, I drive a ton for work, so no, I get it, and I resonate a lot with what you're saying as far as like when I got really into reading history, which was about probably 3 years ago. It was like a immediate additional connection with my dad, who loves to read history and seems like he knows everything. So I relate to that a lot. It's definitely been nice to have somebody to bounce stuff off of and all of that. So you mentioned David McCullough, Hampton Sides. I love both of them. Eric Larson, obviously. Another one of my favorites is Ronald C. White. You ever read anything by him?
Not. I thought you were going to say
okay,
that
so he's,
Ronald Cherkov. I know I'm horribly assassinating his name. Cherkov. He wrote about Titan, about Rockefeller.
Oh, the Rockefeller.
Oh, and Grant and Chernow.
That's what I thought you were saying initially when you mentioned
Ron
that
Chernow.
first name.
Yeah.
I love Titan.
Yep, and they actually, both those authors cover. Yeah, I haven't actually read that one, but I have read what's the Chernow one I read?
It'll make you want to become a capitalist.
I read Washington.
Gotcha. He also does one, I think, on
he's got one on Grant and Hamilton.
And I think the cigarette company, if I'm not mistaken, too. I may be confusing. Winston, the big merger between Nabisco and.
Okay. No, I haven't heard of that one.
Well, and it's exciting that, do you remember, I'm embarrassed to say, the teacher where you guys went to high school, unfortunately, he died, but he was a younger fella, and he used to ride the bus when I was coaching the soccer there. He would ride the bus. He would drive the bus, and I'm so embarrassed I can't remember his name. But he was the one that turned me on to.
Is it Mr. Jones?
No, it was man, he was like
Mr. Henderson.
Mr. Henderson. I should have known.
Super nice guy.
Too,
okay,
and he's the one that turned me on to Aaron Larson. And
really, okay.
Yeah, nice, he used to do like Civil War reenactments, and
that's right. He did over at Nash Farms. That's right.
Yeah, he anyway, they're really good friends with my parents. Yeah, that was sad, but yeah, him and my dad would stay getting in deep conversations. It honestly feels like, I'd be willing to make a stand that all good dads are history dads.
Yeah,
I feel like that's like maybe a qualifying. All good, or at least all good dads read history.
Yeah,
or at least all striving to be good dads.
Yeah, I would think so.
Because my dad too. I know Jesse was saying, but that's obviously my dad's a history teacher, but it does seem to be a correlative thing of especially between Jesse and I, because I don't know if you knew this, Nathan, but Jesse's dad and my dad grew up together.
I did not know that.
They went to high school together, cool. And so his dad was actually the best man at my dad's wedding, and now me and Jesse have been close for a long time too. So it's just kind of funny that we've like both grown up together, and then they both like love reading history, and then Jesse more so than I do. But I mean, I still love reading history too. I'm just not as. It's way tougher for me to comprehend it for sure sometimes, just the breaking down of it. But I still do love it, especially right now. It's the Russian history and like German history right now, which I think I was telling you I'm reading The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shire. And anyway, just that whole we just filmed actually with my dad. We did the first part of that. So that'll come out kind of soon. We did that not that long ago. A couple days ago.
Last week, a few days ago,
yeah. Last week. So anyway, but that's like where I'm like super streaky with like the history and like what I'm interested in. And where I'll just dive in deep. And so Russian history was really what got me first back into, outside of like having to learn curriculum to teach. Like Russian history was like really the first one that like intrigued me, just because I didn't really learn a lot.
Was it like in a school book type Russian, or like a novel specifically about it, or?
No, yeah, it was actually Nicholas in Alexandria by Robert K. Massey. He's written some really good ones. He actually it's a series on the Romanovs. So not on the Romanovs, but just on, maybe it is on the Romanovs, on the Romanov dynasty. So it's Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and then Nicholas in Catherine, or in Alexandria. And so anyway, it's just a fascinating, like, it's like one of my favorite books that I've read, but it's also kind of the nostalgia of like it getting me back into history. But anyway, it's just that the fall of the Romanov dynasty, Lenin kind of coming into the picture, and then Rasputin, and just all the dynamics that are going on at that time. And so that's what got me back. And I can't even remember why I started reading that, honestly. I think maybe one of my teachers recommended it or something, that like when I was student teaching, I think one of my corresponding teachers recommended it to me. But anyway, long story short, now I'm here, which I know, Jesse, you've read, what do you think you've read the most of, like historical genre wise?
I mean, genre would probably be biographies, a lot of those. And then as far as like the specific like subject, like I would say either the Civil War or World War II. I mean, those are the two big ones. Probably the Civil War and biographies on people in that era. But yeah, I mean, World War II is an easy one. I mean, there's just so much out there on it. So
basically, first-hand accounts.
A lot of really good books.
I'm sorry, you broke up there for a little bit. Like first-hand accounts with the soldier on the front line with like the letters home kind of stuff.
Yes. Are you asking me? Sorry, I lost you a little bit there too. Yeah, I only heard like the end part there, I think, but I've read like All Quiet on the Western Front, stuff like that. But more so I've read like either, and I guess I have, I've read like Ambrose, Band of Brothers, Citizen Soldier, stuff like that. So yeah, I've definitely read stuff that, would fit that bill.
But you're more into big political or big historical figures though.
Yeah, I'd say right now I'm usually like mostly into the biographies around big, American historical figures. They're really not even American. I mean, we're reading Napoleon right now, but I really like Roman history. It's a lot different, it's a lot of conjecture and who really knows the details, but it's more entertaining than like, not that I enjoy it more than other types of history, but it seems like if it's written well, like Tom Holland has some really good books on the Roman Empire. And if it's written well, it's like kind of like you're watching a movie. So some of that stuff's really enjoyable as well. God, I just finished talking and then y'all came right back.
Andrew, what's the link for that GoFundMe?
Yeah, I know, right? Well, he just moved, and so I think it's just he's far away from his router because you're downstairs. You're looking at he's got like a nice setup now. It's just he's
I might have to get like
I'm hardwired in. So
Jesse, I got a question for you. When you finish a book, like you would think back of a book that you've read by McCullough or whomever. Is there like a passage you remember or a part that just sticks out? That's something that you will just always comes to mind when you think of that book? Something that was impactful that had impact
of any book.
Like for example, what was the last history book you read, start to finish?
Last history book I read was The Art of Power by John Meacham on Thomas Jefferson.
Okay. Is there this one little phrase or part of it that really, there's kind of one of those things for me when I read a book, I say, man, I'm going to remember that. That's neat. That's cool. Then of course I forget, but every now and then there's something I do remember that I retain.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if there's like a specific line, but I feel like what I remember the most is kind of the fractured relationship between him and John Adams and like just the political stuff, especially during Adams' presidency, that kind of really started to separate them. You had
vicious.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Politically very vicious. But what struck me that I remember so well about that is that it was just a very different time. So, they essentially hated each other politically, but in any letters they had or correspondences, they were very, it was just very proper and respectful, and like they still understood each other to a degree. They just appreciated that they disagreed on these things. Obviously, one thing that strikes out, just about their relationship is that they both died on the 50-year anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
The same day.
Insane.
Hours apart.
I mean, it's crazy. And supposedly one of the last things that John Adams said, and this seems like one of those things that might not be true that someone just said to make it sound cool, but supposedly in some accounts, one of the last things he said was at least Jefferson still lives. And then Jefferson died, not long after. So yeah, a lot of that stuff sticks out. That probably sticks out so much because I had just recently read John Adams before that. So it kind of meshed together really well. But overall, I mean, Jefferson a master politician, a complex and flawed person, very flawed, but a lot of the principles, even if they don't sound the same and they're interpreted a little differently, a lot of the principles that he instilled into politics are still alive today. So it's just kind of crazy to see a lot of things that he said throughout his life are still very applicable to today's societies. Yeah, and that's something that sticks out in a lot of different histories. But yeah, that's what comes up from the last book I read, history, before this one. Yeah,
you'll appreciate this too, Nathan. We actually filmed. Well, I guess it was the day after, but so like I was saying, we just filmed the rise and fall of the Third Reich. So we filmed it actually on November 10th. So it's the 14th today. So on November 9th, 1923. Was the beer hall push,
brown shirts,
where Hitler stormed in, and it's kind of his first big political move, and like for a moment he captures kind of Bavaria's government for a bit, and then has to go off, and then anyway, so it was the 100th year anniversary that we recorded on. Unironically, and I was just joking with my dad and Jesse. I was like, man, surely there's some Germans somewhere that are probably celebrating.
Well,
shame on them, but
we just got out of Oktoberfest, so I'm sure there's some.
There's something going on down there in Munich. But anyway, well, I audioed this. Nathan, you audioed this. I actually am trying. I'm going to try and read the rest of it, but Jesse's our fearless leader here, who has has
truly read it.
Book and truly,
Thank you. Yeah.
Someone say truly read it to himself instead of Nathan and I letting someone else read it to us. But
I was my own narrator. That's the only difference.
Okay, when you listen to David McCullough read his books, I'm telling you, it's intoxicating. If you hear that
man, I bet
read his books, like Americans in Paris was one of the more recent books he did. Talks about cult and the different people that went through Paris, and he is just such a storyteller. It's worth. I'm telling you, one of my little dreams is to go maybe see a lecture or something. Andrew, I apologize, I got off topic, but if you ever have a chance to hear McCullough, he's the narrator. Oh my gosh, you'll never want to hear yourself again.
I didn't even know that was a thing. I'm for sure going to have to check that out.
John Adams. I think if you listen to the audio, I'm pretty sure it's him, or it was either him or maybe the Wright brothers, one of those. But clearly some of the audio's out there. It's read by the author.
Yeah,
and the guy's it's intoxicating.
Wow. Well, I've read both of those, John Adams and the Wright brothers, but I haven't read Americans in Paris yet. I have it, but I think I might just audio that one with him narrating. Since you said that, I didn't know that was a thing.
One brief thing is, it's free. Join the library. It's free.
Yeah, Libby. Is that what you use as Libby?
And then I'm part of two systems, the Fulton County and because I've had rental property for places, I just jump on and have your login and you reserve it when it's available. It just gives a text message letting you know it's there. I mean, for years I did the CD. I would go into a branch and pick up the CDs, but with Libby, if this comes to it, it's free.
Libby makes it super easy.
Yeah. Very cool. All right, sweet. Well, let's jump into it real quick. Before we do, I'll just say, it's obviously already happened several times, but once we actually do get into discussing it, if y'all lose me for a second, whenever I come back, just tell me I have to repeat what I said. It's going to be a nightmare for Andrew, unfortunately, but I'm going to go buy this week. I'm going to go buy one of those things that is supposed to extend your Wi-Fi, and hopefully that'll help.
Dude, I will say, next time I come back down, I literally have a Ethernet cord that's like 60 feet. You just plug it into your router only when you're recording.
Oh yeah, I could probably do it only. Yeah, I could probably make that work.
You know what I mean? Because that enhances your speed by a lot.
Yeah. It's just so strange because I don't ever have any other issues, but of course, when I need it most. So, all right, well, let's dive in. So I'll say it again. We are reading Napoleon, A Life by Andrew Roberts. This book has 20,000 ratings on Goodreads. It's got a 4.19 out of 5 stars. Obviously, we won't be able to give it a rating necessarily overall yet, but because we are just discussing part 1, which is titled Rise, which basically covers everything from Napoleon's birth to the coup, where he essentially takes power. So even though we haven't read it all, what is everyone? I guess actually, Nathan, you have read it all, so you could actually give us a more definitive answer. So I'll actually start with you. Overall, what did you give this book out of 5 stars? Or what would you give it?
A solid 4. 4.3, 4.4, and because part of it is that's one subject matter I've never read much of, right? I've read a lot of historical fiction, and that had to do with the war, but I've never read any actually true history of it. So I was just thoroughly entertained the entire time, not just about Napoleon, but also the Revolution, what was going on with France at the time, and just that whole. Basically, it was all a big setup for World War I. Everything that was happening in that whole time in his lifetime, but it was just unfinished business that was taken care of later. So it was just a fascinating, engaging, entertaining read to me. And I never thought about, this is too much, or I never got I just was going to finish it because you're so far invested into it. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes you just get, I've already read 3/4 of it. I'm just going to, just push through. And I never felt that way. It was entertaining the entire time.
Good. That's good. That's good to know since I'm only a little bit
military. Felt like I could go win a paintball battle now because I understand about basically flanking a maneuver. So.
Right. Yeah. Had the political intrigue, all that stuff, the personal stuff in his life. And Andrew Roberts, I've never read anything else by him, but I do have, I think, one other book by him that I haven't read. It's about George III, King of England. But he's a great writer. It's like you said, it's felt very engaging so far. I haven't at all felt any point like it's sluggish, which that's probably the hardest thing to do, right? Is have a good nonfiction, straight history book and it not feel sluggish at some point. Or I would think as a writer, that would be the most difficult thing to do. I can't really say that I've read a lot that I thought that about, but that's what I would think. You're writing just cold, hard facts. And so to make it engaging and just, you don't really want to put it down when you're reading it. So I'm glad to know that you enjoyed it throughout the entire book. What would you give at this point, Andrew?
So kind of piggyback off what Nathan said. I'm just trying to think about what my prior knowledge of Napoleon was. And so a lot of it really was more just him being a lot different than I thought he was. Like, then I feel like he's kind of grouped into and characterized. Like, I know a lot of people talk about how great he was, especially of like a military mind. But you always kind of, and we haven't gotten there yet, at least you and I, Jesse, but I just kind of assumed he was going to be like a really bad person for some reason. And not that I'm, we're here to judge that, but I don't know. I'm expecting like a Stalin backstory, kind of. I don't know why. Like, I just feel like the history that I've maybe more just assumed and not really like learned is just that he maybe did some bad things. Because, I'm just thinking, all right, people are getting beheaded and all that vibe of what's going on. And, me not really knowing and understanding like what part he played in that. So I just to kind of read early on that on some of the things that he did that characterized who he was, it was just kind of shocking for me. So, but yeah, I mean, the audiobook, I was like at the gym listening to this and I was like stopping mid set. I'm like, oh, I got to write that down. Like, anyway, there was just some cool quotes that he had throughout the book, but yeah, it didn't ever really feel long winded. The chapters felt almost kind of quick to me, honestly. This one, like from me comparing it to Rise and Fall, which I'm audiobooking and reading as well, it feels a little bit quicker to me, like quicker paced. But anyway, the character of Napoleon to me is just really fascinating. And I don't know, again, maybe it's just me like not learning very well, or maybe he's just not covered in like the curriculum in America that in depth. But I don't know. I feel like he needs to be kind of talked about a little more. I feel like we could learn a little more from him, at least from what we've seen in the first part, just from how he did things, at least.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I would agree with both of y'all on the front that I didn't know much about him. Still don't, because I'm not that far into it. But
True.
I've just kind of
regret everything I just said about us like wanting to learn from him. He could turn this around in a bad way.
Yeah, you never know.
It's like, man, Hitler was really motivated. Just kidding.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't know much. I mean, he does say, the author Andrew Roberts does say, I think just in the introduction to the book, he talks about how part of what he's trying to do with this book is show a little bit more of who Napoleon really was, because he kind of says that Napoleon, for the most part, is just kind of seen as like a tyrannical, like modern, a dictator and an Alexander the Great-esque kind of guy, which, as we learned, he did
his hero.
He did love him. He did love him. But there's a little more of a human side, I guess. And there are some moments throughout where you're like, okay, well, he could have been way worse about that. And then you do keep in mind the times and just how things kind of were when it came to war. And you have to factor that in. But anyway, let's dive into it. Let's see what we think. So part 1, Rise. I'm just going to kind of go through it, and y'all just stop me when you have something to add. So Napoleon, born in 1769 on the Mediterranean island of Corsica, essentially born of a low noble class. So not the slums, but also not super well off. Just kind of, I would think that low noble class means like somewhere in the middle of society. That could be wrong. I mean, would you guys agree that that's kind of the vibe you got, that he wasn't poor, he wasn't rich, he was kind of somewhere in the middle? That's kind of what I got.
I think back then you were either you had money or you were poor. I don't think there was this huge middle class.
That's probably true. Yeah.
Right.
That makes sense.
You were either benefiting from someone else turning dirt, or either you were turning dirt, meaning as a farmer. I mean, so
right.
So I would
capitalism hadn't really hit yet.
Yeah, I mean, I would think being the lower noble class that it would compared to 80% of the population, 90% of the population. Because think about it this way, you got to go to school. Think many people just didn't even have school.
Right.
So I'd still put him up there in that top 20%.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, that's fair. That actually makes a lot of sense. Okay, cool. So at an early age, he liked to read a lot, which we talked about this in a previous video. It seems like pretty much it's a theme with just historical figures that end up going on to do great things. Would you agree, Nathan, throughout reading history about big historical figures, that it seems that for the people that we at least can get this information about, it would seem that your Napoleons, your, Jeffersons, all these types of people, they all read from an early age. They were all readers.
It blows me away with how much they were reading. They would read in Latin. They would read in a language that, they would have to learn a language in order to be able to read.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating.
We were talking about, not to keep bringing up Hitler, but that was what we talked about, was like, man, it seems like, and they're not just like, oh, we kind of read sometimes. It's like what they do. It's like all they do is read.
Ben Franklin. I mean, my gosh. I mean, if you ever anything on him, just the way he did the read.
Right.
Ingesting it.
Yeah.
Did you see the quote, Jesse, that the one quote I have is that he says, "I am of the races that founds empires." It was like kind of like a little blurb that he had said. Anyway,
pretty epic quote. So yeah, as far as his reading, he was most often interested in military legends like Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great, which I can't blame him. They're still pretty fun to read about. Obviously, it's from a much different perspective, but so I mean, you see very early on, just even as an adolescent, sure, there's plenty of other adolescents that enjoyed reading Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great, but it makes sense that Napoleon, for the man that he would become, it makes sense that that's what he enjoyed reading the most, I would say.
Yeah.
So
that same topic, Jesse, is he was reading manuscripts that we don't even know about today. I mean, he was reading books, when you really put it in perspective, and it was
right.
And how rare books were and how difficult it was to get a book. So you have to go to a lot of effort in order to be able to have access to them. You got to really want it.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's a very good contextual point, just to kind of put it in perspective. It's now you just go to Amazon, you get a $12 paperback, and, there's 15 million of them in print, or probably more than that. So yeah, that's actually, a good point as well. So you're kind of, like you said, in that top 20%, one of the big things I guess they had access to is just general information and knowledge, which just kind of continued the disparity to a bit.
Yeah. Which that's the benefit of not having to work in the field, is you have time to read.
Right. Yeah.
And you can afford the candle.
I was just about to say you could give a candle in case it's dark. So kind of moving up in his life a bit, he went to a military academy and excelled, being selected into the artillery class. I use the word excelled. I don't know if, I don't think he was top of his class. But from what I remember, the artillery was kind of a more prestigious class to be in.
250.
Okay, so yeah, pretty high then. And the artillery, from what I read, was a pretty prestigious thing to do. So then I have this quote from chapter 1. Napoleon's upbringing imbued him with a reverence for social hierarchy, law and order, and a strong belief in reward for merit and courage, but also a dislike of politicians, lawyers, journalists, and Britain. So, yeah, I thought that was a pretty good quote.
I don't remember that about Britain. And
yeah, right. Right. So, yeah, I mean, this seems like a pretty, a pretty standard, like kind of what you might expect from a guy that ends up being Napoleon. He's into military stuff. He's reading about strategy and tactics and people who took over most of the known world and that sort of thing. So it definitely seems pretty obvious, the stuff that got instilled in him that carried over into his adult life.
Oh, yeah.
They didn't even let him go home for Christmas.
Right.
I mean, he had that Spartan type education, and truly 365 days.
And then there's that fictional story about the snowball fight. He talks about a little bit. I thought that was kind of cool.
Oh, yeah. I forgot about that.
Apparently there's some fictional story of how he planned a snowball fight with like forts, and it lasted 2 weeks, and it was led by Napoleon. It was like, I mean, who knows if it's real. But I mean, that'd be kind of cool if that was real. It's like early on, he's 10 at this, military school in Paris, just
out there grinding with the snowballs.
All the negative that's out there about Napoleon, like, for example, that he's short, right? All of that came about from the British tabloids. They basically were just discounting him. They created the myth that he was short, and they did I don't know if they called them comics back then, or their characters, of him as a short guy, even when he was really average height. But so in other words, so many people today still think that he's short, and it's only because of propaganda done by the Brits, who he hated.
Right.
So.
It's great propaganda.
Right. Yeah. Similar to that snowball story, which, maybe he wasn't short, but I hope that snowball story was true. That's all I'll say.
It would be cool.
Unlikely. So, and Nathan, you can input in here, because as much as I've read recently, like going from, I read the Washington bio, the John Adams and the Thomas Jefferson, and now getting into a little bit of this Napoleon, I still feel like I just have a slither of a grasp on the French Revolution. I feel like this helped me a lot, this book, but that being said, my next note here is when the French Revolution broke out in 1789, Napoleon's first response was that things would calm down quickly. They didn't. And he made his way through the ranks throughout the revolution, becoming a general at the age of 24 in 1793 after the battle at Toulon, where he showed great capacity and bravery and was commended by his superiors. So that kind of just goes over kind of a bit from him just going from the academy to general. But
the fact that he's not even French, though,
I mean,
is wild. That's the other. It's the Bavaria to Germany thing, or Austria to Germany to Bavaria thing. It's like, oh, you hear about these leaders, and it's like, oh wait, they're not even. Then you find out their origin story, and it's like wait, where's Corsica? And then that's why he says, I am of the race that founds empires, because he's Italian, I guess, technically, right? Or
I think they consider themselves Corsican.
Or Corsican, more ethnically Mediterranean, I guess. Because King Louis fifth or sixth bought the island? Is that how that ended up becoming a French? I don't know if you remember.
I'm not sure who it was. It was the 16th that got beheaded in the French Revolution, so I don't know how much longer before that was. I believe. Wasn't it the 16th? I believe so.
This is not my wheelhouse.
But
anyway, I think it was like in his lifetime that Corsica was like early on, right? In his childhood. Is that, am I remembering that correctly? That
it's almost like treated like a colony. They had some self-government, but they were under the loving arms of France.
Okay.
Right. And it seemed like early on, like maybe kind of most Corsicans had some sort of disdain for France, but pretty soon after Napoleon is in France for a while, he kind of switches the script up and he just kind of becomes a huge fan of France. He seems to kind of fall in love with it to a degree, a little bit. And, I mean, not long after that, he's essentially in some regards going against Corsica, or at least some Corsicans, when it comes to the French Revolution.
Yeah, there's that one guy,
Yeah, I forget the guy's name.
That one guy really had it out for him. Yeah, he was like a leader in the Corsican. I might have written it down. Anyway.
Yeah, but would you agree with that, Nathan? Was that your kind of surmisation of his feelings?
Yeah, I think he loved Corsica, and he invested in it. Of course, amazing thing about his rise in the military career is how little he worked. He was off. He would take these leaves.
Right.
His mother's estate and family estate, and getting into politics. And my take on it is he was absolutely pro Corsica until it was beneficial for him to be pro France.
Yeah.
In other words,
that's a good
until
take.
He could get until France was going to back him, and then he's like, all right, yeah, France.
I mean, because about the French Revolution, I'm going to really steer into something a little bit bizarre, right? But I'm going to ask you guys a question. You understand? Do you know why zebras are black and white? When that's total opposite of what the Serengeti looks like. When you look out there, all the other animals blend in. Then you got the zebras that are black and white. Well, the reason is, imagine if you're hunting zebra, you can't distinguish one zebra from the other because they're all black and white. So when a lion's attacking, right, or a cheetah or whatever, is attacking the zebras, the only time they can actually get one is when they separate it out from the others so it stands alone. Until then, it's just like this blur of, and like if you're a pack of lions, which one do you attack? That zebra or that zebra? They all look the same.
Right.
Why am I telling you this ridiculous story? To survive in the French Revolutionary period, you could not stand out, because the second you got out of line, you lost your head.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just wicked. The guy who prevented, the guy who designed the guillotine was killed by a guillotine. Because the changing winds, and somehow or another, this guy survived the flow.
Right.
Whether it was the royalists, the Jacobins.
And you saying that, right? Yeah, you saying that actually brings up another previous book that Andrew and I read that neither one of us really loved, but we both appreciated it for what it is. But we recently read for the first time A Tale of Two Cities, which is very heavily, hits those themes that you just said of if you stand out, it's a good chance you're going to get your head cut off. That makes sense. Yeah, it went a little over our heads. It was kind of confusing, and we also audibled it, and it was a tough one to audible.
Yeah.
For me,
I read half of it, and it didn't. Well, I read half of it, and it really didn't seem to matter. Once we really broke it down by using external sources, I was like, "Wow, this is a great book." I just didn't catch all these twists because I didn't understand the writing style. But what you said, Jesse, it definitely helps understand too. But definitely the ebbs and flows, because if I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure Napoleon's family, the Bonapartes, supported the French monarchy in Corsica.
You had to make it.
I mean, he got lucky that he didn't get the axe.
Make a Seinfeld comparison?
Yeah,
I love please.
Yes.
Basically, Jerry was dating a girl, but he really liked her roommate, and he had to make the switch. And George
was it the menage a trois thing?
The switch. How can you? Get the other roommate's attention, but not create the fury from the other one. And George was like, "It's impossible. It can't be done." And they, work on it and think about it, and then his trick was to ask for a menage a trois, thinking, the one girl would be so flattered that she'd be excited, but then the one he's trying to get rid of would be so insulted, right? And that was how it was going to happen. And of course, Jerry's demise, they were all into it, and that he was not into it. So how do you go from being the military arm of that royalist faction, and then all of a sudden still transition to the other side? I mean, that's delicate.
It is.
I think he was pretty small initially, correct? In other words, I think he was not high ranking during the most turbulent time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, during the terror and everything like that. Yeah, he was not. Yeah, he was very low. I think it was
just taking orders, really.
Yeah, just taking orders during the terror and stuff like that. So that's a very good distinction, actually, as well. Is he probably missed as far as being in or near his prime when he would have been most active. He probably missed the worst of the French Revolution
young too, right?
Yeah, he was young. Yeah, he was 24 when he was made a general.
And I'm like, I'm 27 or 26, and I'm like,
I'm far from being a general. I'll tell you that.
It's just insane.
It is, and I have a quote here about it. Actually, my next note to touch off what both of y'all are saying is he had spent 5.5 years as a second lieutenant, a year as a lieutenant, 16 months as a captain, only 3 months as a major, and no time at all as a colonel. And on December 22nd, 1793, having been on leave for 58 of his 99 months of service, with and without permission, and after spending less than 4 years on active duty, Napoleon was made at 24 a general. And that's just, it sounds made up, 24 years old. It's wild. It's really wild stuff. And I think if I remember correctly, obviously he had some maneuverings that helped him get there, but if I remember correctly, it was kind of a supply and demand thing as well. Like they needed people in certain seats. So it wasn't like it was just off his merit.
Their heads. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Or basically moved away, fled the country.
Yeah.
So as cool as that is, he was, to his, own knowledge, putting himself in a precarious position, in a position that other people had lost their heads in, at a very young age. You guys got me again?
Oh, we're back.
I think you said to something about his knowledge, and he got himself
just into a precarious position in which, a lot of his predecessors lost their heads in,
sure.
At a young age.
I feel like he was also, and I could be wrong, he went back to Corsica, right, and was going to try and move up there. And then I think it's Paul or something like that, was maybe the guy who was in exile, and he returns to Corsica. And I remember it was something about like him running for an election, maybe in the Corsican Assembly. And basically the Pauli guy, like, I don't know if it's like an underhand thing, but essentially he doesn't get elected for anything. And he has all this experience. Well, not like on the ground experience for long terms, but, he at least has these titles in the French military, and then he's not given anything. And then there's the one quote I have though, like around this is, he says that laws are like statues of some divinity, which on certain circumstances must be veiled, was like his response essentially to not being elected in the Corsican Assembly, when I guess in his mind, he was like the most
qualified.
Yeah, exactly. And then it seems like that's kind of what like angled him back. Like, yeah, like the ebbs and flows of, he just was missing
he was
the
kind of an
beheadings.
idealist. He was an idealist, right? Thinking, I have, and at the end of the day, he just didn't spend enough money.
True.
Right. An idealist is a good term for him. Right.
Kind of naive, thinking they're going to elect the best person,
Yeah, that's true.
Right. Some of his first endeavors into the political environment did not go well. So following that, and if there's anything again to throw in between these comments, let me know, because I just took notes kind of usually at the end of chapters or somewhere in the middle when something kind of popped out. But next thing I've got is that he was given the command of the Army of Italy, roughly 50,000 soldiers, to fight against the Austrian Piedmontese forces. Once the campaign began in earnest, Napoleon led his armies to 3 victories 3 days in a row to force the Piedmontese to armistice negotiations. So this was kind of his first, like, starting to like really get his feet wet in military like actions. And it seemed, this kind of struck me as like Grant-esque, Ulysses Grant, and just the fact that, it's very different. They're very different, but if you kind of take a lot of it away, you've got 2 guys, Grant's a little more, came from hard scrabble and kind of had nothing. So it's obviously different contextually, but once they get, to the show, they start kind of like really popping off and like winning some victories kind of consecutively.
Players.
Yeah. And that's what it seemed like. Obviously very different circumstances and different outcomes and such, but it just kind of slightly reminded me of that.
His preparation, that was like the one thing in chapter 3 that really stuck out to me. It seemed like so often it was talking about like some document that he was requesting about the landscape here. And then, can we get shoes for this regiment? Can we, he wasn't the kind of sit back and like let other people figure it out kind of guy, but take all the credit. He was seemingly like really out there trying to get as much information as possible so that he could make the best decisions for his group.
And what really stood out to me about this campaign in Italy was the fact that so many people wanted him to fail. The competitiveness of the other long-term military guys that were older, that had, here was this young upstart Corsican, like we say that kind of in a derogatory sense. They, really wanted him to fail. He was for a certain extent, living off the land with his soldiers. And so he took little and was able to create so much more with it despite, and not being supported, not getting the troops he needed, not getting the horses. And so that's what really stood out to me about the greatness of those first campaigns.
And it seems like a recurring theme in this first part of the book. Whenever he's in any kind of campaign or engagements or anything, it seems like, for the most part, he was very boots on the ground, wanting to add to the morale of his men. And again, to make a comparison to Grant, like what you were just saying, Loach, Grant was a quartermaster at one point before he really made his way through the ranks. And Napoleon seemed to have his bearings as far as that stuff as well, to attest to what you just said, Loach, as far as making sure people have shoes and making sure they've got, enough, alcohol or whatever, and just all these different things, doing what he can to keep the morale of his men up. And that seems like a recurring theme, is that he knew, if I want to get certain things done and be successful, I have to have people who believe in me and who I support properly, or I'm not going anywhere.
And also a part of that too was appealing to the honor and national pride of being French. And that's very similar to, Andrew, you mentioned Hitler, of course. That seems to, comparison as far as that, appealing to this national brotherhood of being German. And so he basically created pride around being a French, and it was almost like, you are the best, and was, you are the best soldier, you're the best prepared, and they bought into it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because he did the medals
they were heroes,
thing, right?
And the stuff came back to the news reports. Of course, we know he lied about a lot of things.
Oh yeah,
right.
Stuff, yeah.
He lied a lot about what was getting back. He lied to his wife, right, as well. But anyway,
right. Well, speaking of his wife, my next note.
Am I making that up? Didn't he create a bunch of awards to? Maybe it was not after the Italian, not voyages, but the Italian pushes. But wasn't he kind of creating these facade awards to build morale? Or am I making that up? I feel like I remembered something along the lines of that. Maybe not.
Did anybody answer that question?
Well, I think I do think he absolutely took the time to acknowledge the heroism and reward the soldiers who achieved. So I think he absolutely. I kind of got the opinion he would be the guy sticking on the ribbon. Acknowledging greatness. So I don't know specifically about a specific award, like a Navy Cross or they didn't have a Navy, right. But what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah, that does ring true to some degree. I don't know if there were specific awards, but just in morale in general, it seemed like he was always working to get that stuff done. So yeah, next, speaking of his wife Josephine was not reciprocal to the many. Huh? I'm sorry, I must have lost y'all again.
No, I heard you. I was just in the background saying yikes when you said his wife.
Oh, my bad. So she was not reciprocal to the many long letters Napoleon wrote to her while he was in Italy, as she was busy with, what's his name? Hippolyte Charles, whatever his name was. She was getting it on with this guy. Yeah, and it seemed inferred that there were many others.
And junior in rank too.
I mean,
that's brutal.
Yeah, and it kind of, it's one thing that attests to, because Napoleon never really does anything to this guy, this one particular one. It kind of does speak to, he's not a complete tyrannical maniac, so he had some, maybe he didn't care that much, because at that point maybe he didn't respect his wife and really care. Who knows? But it seemed, based on his letters leading up to that point, that he cared a lot.
She kind of led him to believe that she was pregnant.
Yeah, right.
That was wild.
That's messed up, man. Do that to a man that's out on the war campaign.
How, and it'd be famous thing about, hope little Napoleon is doing well in your belly, kind of thing. And
right. You just really feel for him in those moments.
You really do. I was going to say that. He was really writing some bangers of letters back, dude. He was pouring his heart out in some of them, and nothing. Just nothing back.
Nothing.
I expect I'll see you within the next few weeks, and she's all frolicking around,
right?
France,
It takes him 6 months.
To know about
spending his money,
right?
It was a public thing, seemingly.
Yeah,
in England, it definitely. About it. They were capturing the letters. They got the dispatches.
That's true.
Yep. Oh man, that's rough. That is one thing that's interesting, as a constant factor in this time period, and then these campaigns so far, is you're just kind of having to assume that half of your letters are just getting taken and read by your enemy, which is a pretty interesting thing to think about. But so yeah, these early military campaigns in Italy are where Napoleon honed in his military prowess. A major key to his success was his treatment of his men, as he was always known to mingle with them and keep morale up in various ways. He once said, and this kind of closes off, us talking about that, "Severe to the officers, kindly to the men," was a quote that he apparently had, which seems like a reoccurring theme in this era of war, is that the officers were kind of the ones that got, the whip, if you will, and scolded and that type of thing. Whereas the men, they were usually, it seems like a good leader was usually more keeping their morale up, whereas the officers were like, hey, you guys got to help me keep this whole thing together.
Another example of that is, some generals, in order to maintain command, firing squads, right? Hangings, whatever. And he's really not known for that. He's not known. I'm sure it's happened, and there were times where there was someone executed. Yet in general, he had a lot of grace with that, and that's something else that kind of came out in the reading.
Yeah, I did pick up on that as well. That's very true. I'm seeing now that I'm revisiting my notes how many freaking typos I have in here. In 1797, Napoleon oversaw and signed the Campo Formio that ended 5 years of war with Austria. The following year, he informed the Directory that an invasion of England would be near impossible at the time, given England's naval supremacy. So they decided to send him to Egypt instead. So to kind of close off with the Campo Formio and all that stuff, it seems like Napoleon pretty much himself, while he's kind of, throughout this whole campaign in Italy, it kind of seems like this is where he starts to really gain power over the Directory that's supposed to be governing him. So it seems like there's a switch.
Informed the Directory.
Right. Right.
I wrote that down and crossed it out and underlined it. Informed. He informed them what he did.
Yeah.
Right. And that seems where that this kind of change happens in his life. I'm sorry, I just got distracted by something else. But yeah. So he pretty much just tells them that, look, we're not going to be able to handle England right now, so we might as well go the other way. And so they essentially, the directory agrees with him, decides to send him to Egypt. So he gets to Egypt. Before we go to Egypt, was there anything else kind of from the Italian campaigns or anything else that we didn't touch on in this early stage of his life that you guys wanted to add?
I think it's important to mention the money that he was making for France.
True.
I think that's such a key part of why he was able to get away with what he could, and was that he was sending money back. And in fact, he would say, of the money I'm sending you, I kept X amount out for this or that. So, and the economy of war and what that really meant, and that money had to keep going back to France in order, for him to be able to get away with what he was getting away with. It's kind of like a salesman with a company who's making a lot of money. They can get away with whatever they want because they're bringing in money.
Yeah.
Right. That's a really, really good point as well. I forgot about that factor of it.
Yeah. It reminds me too of almost like how the NBA is now. Like if you have a superstar, they can literally.
I'm glad
do
you're getting
some
wild associations. I feel like I'm the one that get us off topic tonight. So
about the
NBA.
You saying that literally spark of like, he kind of was like, James Harden just saying, I'm going to get traded. And it's like, wow, these $1 billion companies are like, yes, you are. Or, like you will fire the coach. And it's like, oh, okay. So anyway, sorry.
I think another thing to talk about before we go to Egypt as well is he did military different than anyone else. And I think that's really a key point for the whole story, is part of his successes because he was doing things different than, they compared him to the Austrian generals or Austro-Hungarian generals who were trying to help with Italy. They were older. They were 70 years old, 60 years old. They had been a long career, but that career, they did things the same way they'd always done it. And then here he came away with innovative tactics, maneuvering, and speed that was led to his also being successful. And that's kind of a key part because he was doing things differently that other people never had. It very similar to the Blitzkrieg.
Yeah.
In the sense of they'd never seen type of the movement and the quickness of the troops and how they were pushed around. So, and that kind of comes back to bite him later in his career. So,
was that what it was called? Like it was like the divisional square or something like that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Is that what it was? What was it again? It was like an arrow that would be able to pivot or something. Was that? There was something very like unique about it, right? That was just revolutionary.
Well, the square, it really devalued the role of the cavalry because the cavalry would charge through, and when you're in the square, and whether you have the pikes or whatever you would have, that basically the horses would not drive through the square, so the cavalry could not trample you. But before the square, when you have a road, man, the cavalry could go down the flank and just wipe you out.
Okay. Right, and he mentions how in one of those engagements, when a cavalry does try to charge the square, the horses they basically just kind of start doing circles. And I think he said that he saw one guy on a horse whose horse was just kind of off to the side doing just doing its own circle. So it just totally freaked these horses out. Yeah. Using up all its horsepower. So cool. Jump into Egypt. And before we really get into Egypt, so my understanding was that France's kind of underlying purpose for going to Egypt was really to affect Britain. That was kind of my understanding, to get resources, but to also have a negative effect on Britain. Am I missing anything major as far as their intentions there?
That was to get rid of Napoleon too, right? Because he was getting a little bit too much clout.
Yeah, I guess from the directory's point of view, yeah.
Absolutely, I would agree with that. And Britain had the wealth from all its colonies, the wealth of the money that was coming in. And, France wanted to share the pie.
Right. Okay, so cool. So,
India, right? They're trying to block trades to India, I'm guessing, too.
India?
Oh, no, yeah, I'm just saying in general, like Britain is trying to get trade routes to India through this area. So I'm sure this was kind of an influential area to kind of take over some ground.
Right. So yeah, lots of good reasons for them to want to kind of take things over. So he's goes to Egypt. He's occupying Egypt in Cairo, from Cairo. And for a while there, it seems like there's a little chunk of this chapter, not a chunk, but at least several pages where he's just kind of trying to quell like the local populace, deal with uprisings and kind of things like that. Because obviously nobody's looking to get overtaken when they're already under the thumb of somebody else. So it doesn't seem like, at first at least, that the Egyptians saw Napoleon as some kind of deliverer. It just kind of ended up making things worse in Egypt for a time at least.
The people had an overlord. It's just who was their overlord.
Yeah. Right. So let's see. And I have this quote in here. So I get this is like kind of at the time of him being in Egypt. So on March 12th, 1799, the War of the Second Coalition began, with France eventually pitted against the monarchs of Russia, Britain, Austria, Turkey, Portugal, and Naples, and the Pope. So really, really setting themselves up for something. And that was a direct quote from chapter 8 in the book. So really, I don't have a ton of notes really on Egypt. The next thing I have is when he heads over to Syria. Is there anything else from Egypt specifically that either you guys remember, or anything important?
Like it's the whole Islam thing.
That's a good.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah,
that was great.
He kind of acted like he was about to be converted, right? I think he was all. I think he would have done it besides the circumcision. I think that was
right.
Seemed to be a stickler for him.
Like wearing headdresses and stuff too, or he was like really going all in. I think, right?
I think there was a reference in the book where they know that they're pretty sure he dressed up like in kind of all the garb or whatever word you would use at one point, but then there were a lot of other times that he obviously wouldn't. But yeah, that was an interesting thing that he seemed to also have taken from. I haven't really read a ton about Alexander the Great necessarily, but it seemed like something that he kind of adopted from his readings of Alexander the Great, how Alexander would kind of adopt religions in certain places. Again, I don't know if that's accurate or if I'm misremembering that, but it seems like he was kind of influenced in some regard and saw the benefit of going into a place and not only respecting their religion, but kind of seemingly, as you said, Nathan, kind of seeming to adopt it and put it up on a pedestal as the superior religion.
Yeah. It's a very Roman thing to do as well, to be able to allow the people to do their own thing, as long as they
maybe it was Julius Caesar
comparison, bend the knee. Yeah, bend the knee.
Right.
As long as you
Genghis Khan did the same, right?
Yeah, he typically just would I mean, he'd mess them up pretty good, but then once he left, he'd leave a few people in charge and say, all right, as long as I get your resources or whatever my tax is from this place, you can kind of do what you want as long as you obey these couple of laws. But yeah, that was a big thing with Genghis Khan too. Yes, him leaving people's religions kind of be.
And Jesse, you just said something as well that I think is real important, is the resources. They absolutely, for the glory of France, in Italy and anything of value, anything historic, anything treasure, you're just put on a boat.
Yep.
You can
That's
see it in the
good
Louvre
point.
today.
Right.
That is true.
Yeah.
Imagine being a French soldier from Paris and all of a sudden you're in Cairo, walking through the desert. I mean, it's just, what a change of scenery. I mean, it's just almost comical, especially to think of in the late 1700s too. I mean, that had to be brutal.
Seeing a pyramid.
You're just going from Paris or, wherever, Normandy, and then...
Right.
What about you seeing a Nile crocodile eat one of your buddies? I mean, it's just,
That's a good point.
Joe, I wouldn't swim there, or a Claude.
Yeah.
Sorry, not Joe,
yeah.
Claude.
I wouldn't get in there. Yeah, Claude.
Francois, I'd stay out of there if I was you.
Oh, that's funny. Okay, yeah, those were both really good points. The religion thing and then the art and artifacts thing. He was always, every time they went somewhere, Napoleon was basically like, all right, all their most expensive stuff, put it in the boat, send it back to France.
And it would be paraded in France. You know what I'm saying? When this stuff came back into Paris, it went in front of the populace as very similar to, what do they call it when you came back in Rome, when they let the general come in to the city? A triumph.
The triumph. Yep.
It's very similar to a triumph in the sense of, look at our greatness, and bringing back some of the others in chains. There's all. I think the word we haven't discussed yet tonight is symbolism, and I think that's basically that's a lot of what that is.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. It's one of the big. And Nathan, you'll be able to speak to this way more than I can, because I still feel like a novice in reading. Which I feel like the more you read, the more you realize how much you don't know. And that's the sense I mean it in, that there's just so much out there. But that seems like a really, you're right. We haven't said that yet, but that seems like like one of the most important tenets of, especially in this era, and then all the way back to Rome, like you said, is having these symbols, whether it's a person that's like a figurehead or a symbol of victory, or having the spoils of war, as they would say, coming back. It seems like a very big thing too, because you never really think about this until you do. But a country's at war, and Napoleon and his armies are off in Egypt, but there's still a populace back home that has to keep the economy going, that has to go to work every day, that has to keep things clean. And there's got to be something while they're spending a year and a half away in Egypt. There's no CNN, getting these real-time images. So there has to be symbolism, like you're saying, for the people to still have faith, because no matter what kind of regime you're in, the populace at some point has to be in consideration, because, either they're going to revolt or too many people are going to die, and you're not going to have the economy you need to uphold your government. So that's a really important point you made there, I think. All right. Sweet. So the next thing I have is that, so this Second Coalition Wars began. He leaves Egypt to go on a campaign in Syria, which ended with the siege of Acre. And so Acre is it Acre? Should it be said a different way as a French word, or is it Acre?
Acre.
Good point.
I was thinking the exact same thing.
Je m'appelle Nathan.
So this was, basically his campaign in Syria ends with Acre, this siege of Acre, which was unsuccessful, and he was forced to reverse. It was during this campaign that the massacre of Jaffa took place, in which 3,000 prisoners were executed. And it seems like it was mostly like the more foreign looking, if you will, prisoners that were executed. That's kind of the information that I got. So this seems like it was, I'd never heard of it before, the massacre at Jaffa, of Jaffa, but this seems like a very big kind of moment in Napoleon's career, is this massacre that occurs.
They kill a messenger, right? This wasn't like completely unprovoked, right?
Yeah, they beheaded,
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
a French messenger, yes. And so he was like, where are those 3,000 prisoners at? Let's go kill them. And then they just kill them and like leave half of them in the river. So that's kind of mostly what I have. I think this was really, I don't think it was his first loss, but this was like the first, what's considered his first like loss that really matters, was his unsuccessful siege of Acre. But even though it was unsuccessful, you know, in certain terms, Napoleon kind of, as you kind of alluded to earlier, Nathan, Napoleon kind of spins it as if the siege of Acre was a success, when looking back on history, it doesn't really seem that way. What would you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a long way from home. He was out of the European theater. Those supply lines are stretched and a little ambitious there. I mean, how many people have failed? That's where Alexander failed, was in the Middle East. That's where he finally went too far.
Right.
And so it's kind of ironic that I don't know the exact geographic, you know what I'm saying? I'm not saying it was the same specific area, but clearly that's where Alexander met his end, was in the Middle East. So it's kind of ironic. And it has to do with the weather. It's the walk. I mean, the whole same as like the Crusades. I mean, you have these Europeans going out there and not familiar with it. It did not seem to hurt him politically. It did not seem to really taint his star, if that makes any sense. So that's probably because of his own propaganda.
True.
Right.
I mean,
but eventually these French soldiers all come back home, and they tell them, they talk about what really happened. Eventually, they all come home.
Right.
Yeah. The Egyptian students that I had in Kuwait all speak French. Still.
Really?
Interesting.
So, I know that there's some, more further colonization later on, but it does seem like the early seeds that,
that's pretty interesting, actually.
Still be there. Yeah.
Well, until the book, I had no idea he did anything in the Middle East at all. I mean, I was naive to that. Would never have imagined that.
Well, I think the only reason I thought that I'd heard was because of the Sphinx and it not having a nose. I don't know why. I feel like I had heard some story before that they had shot off the nose as target practice, which I think he even addresses.
He does.
Andrew Robinson. I think that's maybe not true, that it was already like that. Is that what you remember too? Or
he infers that they didn't do that and that there's no indication that happened.
It was like a joke, right? They set up as a picture. Right. Yeah, that's what it was. Okay,
yeah.
I remember that story, but yeah, I don't even. It's like a vague memory. I don't know why I've heard that story for some reason.
And they were attacked when they were in the desert by these raiders. Basically kind of a guerrilla type warfare. As the army moved through the desert, these guys would come in and just raid the back end and just the supply chains. There was just a constant. These armies were massive, as they moved through.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's one thing he did, is he got rid of a lot of the camp followers. That's one of the reasons that made his army more mobile. Is he just basically cut off all the because literally whole moving towns used to follow the army.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's one of the biggest things I learned and started to conceptualize when I started reading history, especially anything that involved war, military histories and that kind of thing, is you don't think about it, until you read about it, but you got to have a line going back to wherever you came from or you're going to run out of stuff. And it seems so obvious and simple, but it's like one of the biggest, it's one of the foundational facets of having a military campaign. And it's a big thing that comes up like in the Vicksburg campaign that Grant had in the Civil War. It's
Russia in World War I.
Russia, and then you have Germany in World War II. It's like a constant theme throughout where it's like, if you run out of stuff, you're not going to be able to keep fighting. So this is like priority number one, or we have to go home.
If you ain't got a bullet.
Exactly. That's the first thing I think of, honestly. Like, it's a core memory for me from the Nicholas and Alexandria book of Russia not having enough guns into World War I. And so they gave guns to the guys on the front lines, and the guys behind them picked up the guns as the guys were killed in front of them. And it's like, or they would have like 3 bullets, and it's like, all right, charge. You get 3 shots. Use them well. It's like, what?
And if the men in front of you did not charge the enemy, the officer behind you would take you out.
Oh, yeah. I mean, brutal times.
I mean, that sounds pretty terrible to me.
Think about how young these people were. Think about how young. This is another thing that captivates me about this history is they were these 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old, that in put in these unbelievable situations in a foreign land when they had never even been outside their own home village, and all of a sudden here they are, like you said, in Syria or in Egypt, and in this exotic lands, and just it's just something that's really hard for me to fathom, and I could get really bogged down, and I just cannot imagine being able to do it, really. You know what I'm saying? It's just shocking.
Yeah. It's like modern day playing for Alabama or something. I don't know. What is it? Do you think being in Napoleon's army qualifies for? I guess it wasn't just a select few, or was it?
Well, he was the Alabama of the day. I mean,
yeah, you wanted to be in his brigade, probably.
People. He got away with a lot of his successes just because we're facing Napoleon.
Yeah.
And that's another just recurring theme too that you just hit on. World War I, World War II, all of these, the Korea. You can go back as far as you want in history. It's a lot of just boys who don't know much about life, have never been anywhere. Sorry, that was on me. I cut out, but yeah, just kids. I mean, the first thing I always think about when I think of it is like, Normandy, and there being that story of that one county or city in Virginia somewhere, where 21 of the, age group that went to war at that time, there were 21 kids in the town, and only like 2 of them came home. And that was just all throughout the country. And then, it's directly applicable to this war and this thing in Egypt, where you just got these kids who have probably never been outside their hometown until they joined up. Next thing you know, they're looking at a pyramid, and then they're trekking across the desert to go to Syria, and they're just like, "What are we doing
in the Holy Land?"
Yeah.
All you gotta do is go over to Hampton and drive through downtown Hampton, and they have the flag set up on Veterans Day or Memorial Day.
Yep.
And it has the name and the war they signed in. And when you see these guys World War I, you realize imagine Hampton now compared to World War I. They had never left Henry County in their life, and then they were in France.
Oh yeah.
Gosh, that's really crazy to think about. And if it happens here again, we're going to end up in God knows where, Russia or the Ukraine, Middle East.
That's
who knows?
What's the craziest thing is that we wouldn't even be drafted currently.
We wouldn't.
Of the age restriction, because you always think like, man, I could get drafted, because I still view myself as young, and it's like, wait,
right?
I'm too old to get drafted, and that just puts
why you're too old
on
to get drafted,
the people
right?
who were.
You know why you're too old? Because you'll die. They know, and sadly enough, they know the 18, 19, 20-year-old kids don't think it's going to be them.
That's true. My
That's
frontal
a really
cortex
good point.
Too developed. Yeah, I have that fear that I didn't have when I was 18. That is definitely true.
Yeah. The average age was a decade younger than we are now of these kids fighting in World War II, at least.
Yeah, that is crazy. 10 years?
A decade. And a lot of them didn't come home.
Wow.
I mean, a bunch of them. So yeah, that's a crazy, sad part about wars. That's pretty consistent throughout history. So, doesn't work out at Acre. Upon his return to Cairo, Napoleon learned that learned that a Turkish-led force was attempting to take Alexandria. So he went that direction, defeated them in battle. And then at this point, this is where he goes back to France. So, France is basically facing potential invasion from a British-Russian-Austrian alliance, which just sounds really rough to go up against. So Napoleon sailed for home. During this voyage, he stops in Corsica. This is the last time he's ever going to see this place for the rest of his life. So this is leaving Egypt before stuff really goes down, before the coup. Last time he ever sees home. And this was a part that stuck out to me in the book, because it seemed like a milestone. It's like, okay, it seems like he's got his build-up kind of underneath him, and then he goes by his home for the last time. That seems kind of like poetic, or something you'd see out of a movie. He goes and cuts his teeth, all over the world, goes and sees home one last time, and then he goes and takes over the government. It seems kind of like a pretty wild setup, pretty crazy turn of events.
Ridley Scott should make a movie about that.
I want
to
draw attention to another comparison to John Adams. Remember in that novel where he was sailing to France, I think his son was with him, and he was chased by a British warship, and he would have been hung. If they had caught him, he would have been hung, right?
Yep.
Well, the Brits, they controlled the Mediterranean, so it was this. If you remember, I think they talked about kind of by fortune that the main British fleet was over here by Sicily or wherever they were, that he was able to safely make it back. Because to a certain extent, luck has to do with these guys.
That's true. Yeah.
Right.
Man,
and it's just another. It was just another crazy thing about this era is we don't appreciate it much, but when they talk about going from France to Egypt or America to France, you can skip over it easily in a book, but that is a hazardous, long voyage that a lot of people don't make it home from because of just the nature of the times. And it's, we got Wager Island that we recently read. And speaking of John Adams again, not only is it crazy to fathom just as any person, but John Quincy Adams, while his dad is in France working on, just the relationship between America and France.
He goes to Russia.
Sends Quincy back. Yeah, he goes all over the place, man. He travels for 15 months, I think, of them not knowing where they're 15, or maybe it was 11 and he's 15 years old, I think. So 11 months, almost a year of travel, going to all these different places. His mom and dad are on two different continents. Their 15-year-old is just traveling the world on a boat in the raging seas.
With letters of introduction.
Right. Right.
Feed me dinner, sir.
Yeah, I'm Quincy. Nice to meet you. So yeah, that's a very good point. I think so. I think he went to Russia, and then I think he stopped somewhere else before going back home. But it was just, that's a whole nother subject. But John Quincy's adolescent life and his childhood is insane. The stuff he did, the people he knew, and the people he got to talk to. As many languages as he could speak. Fascinating stuff. So it's the last time he'll see Corsica. They seem to kind of button up, him and Josephine seem to kind of button up their marriage to a degree at this point. The book indicates that, at least from this point in time, Andrew and I haven't gotten any further, so who knows what Josephine's going to do in the future. But it seems like at this point there's kind of a bit of a buttoning up of their marriage. I think Charles Hippolyte kind of dumped Josephine, so that was probably more the reason why it happened. But it seems like Napoleon kind of got back and was like, all right, stuff's really happening for me now. We need to figure this out because you're kind of an embarrassment. That's kind of the vibe I got.
There was a love affair. So I think at this point, the true love affair mutual thing began.
Right. Okay, cool. So this next note I have is kind of long, but France was in rough shape, obviously. The Directory has failed its people many times over. Napoleon won territories only for them to be lost by France after he left. There is a British blockade that's kind of destroyed a lot of the markets. There was the war with the Second Coalition, as well as the quasi-war with America over the U.S. repayment of debts. Paper currency was almost worthless. The Jourdan Law approached universal military conscription. Freedom of the press was heavily restricted. Hyperinflation was devastating the economy. And then I have a quote. Perhaps worst of all, people couldn't see how anything could improve because revisions of the Constitution had to be ratified 3 times by both chambers at 3-year intervals, and then by a special assembly at the end of the 9-year process. Like, after just reading that paragraph, I'm probably revolting too. It sounds terrible in France at this point in time. That legislation process is ridiculous. It's crazy.
You get a 9-year-old after it.
It's ridiculous. So that just kind of sums up very briefly and very that's kind of the very tip of the iceberg as far as what's going on in France. Do you have anything to add to that, Nathan or Andrew, as far as the state of France when Napoleon returns right before the coup?
Well, I don't think he could have done a coup unless it was messed up.
Right.
Perfect storms. there's always perfect storms for these leaders, and it brings up a point. I can't remember if it was you or my dad that brought up on the last one of, is it great men, or what is it? It was something about essentially like, is it just the times that make the men, or is it the men themselves that are great?
Some men are born great,
others are
right. Yeah, the some men are born great, others have greatness thrust upon them kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well, and I think you can do these military coups because you have a military. And I'm not trying to be smart when I say that. And so you had this administrative government who wanted power, they wanted control. And the best way that they can protect that is to downgrade the military, cut pay, put people out on reserves, fire them for all intents and purposes, and because that's, I'm sure they were scared of the strength of the military, just as Rome was, right? And so I think what's that phrase? When they crossed the Rubicon, meaning when he brought his army over the river, he kind of made a statement. And the military, in loving, because they had tasted success. They when they go on these ventures, they make money. These soldiers make money. I mean, they make spoils outside of their pay, and so they tasted success. So, and their general helped them be successful. And here they were marginalized in the non-war years during the peace years. So, and that's where he gets his power, is the military. I'm going to bring you back to greatness. And so,
and how about a parallel of, in this moment, a parallel between Napoleon and Washington? Because George Washington arguably had even more sway and power in the current, and obviously, again, circumstances are different things are going on, but George Washington did something different. My understanding from the biographies I've read of George Washington is when the Revolutionary War was won, I mean, a lot of people were ready to just make him the next king of America, and give him all the power. And to your point, like Napoleon, he had control of the military. And he was, I mean, I don't know if an American citizen has ever been more anything close to being worshipped by the populace than George Washington. So I think it's a cool, untouchable. I think it's a cool parallel that, not to say that just outright Washington's better than Napoleon, and not to say that, again, we haven't gotten far into the book yet, but all my point would be the two people in different situations, granted, but two people in a somewhat similar situation handled it differently. George Washington, there wasn't a need for a coup necessarily, but he could have taken a lot more power than he did. Now, obviously, a little bit later, he does become president, but it's two different cases. But, I think it's a cool parallel to see that two different decisions were made. Napoleon went the route of, I've got the military power and I'm going to say what happens. Washington went the route of, I did what I was charged with, got the war taken care of. I'd like to just kind of peace out for the rest of my life. Which he didn't, he couldn't. But what do you think about that parallel, Nathan? You think that's fair to say or compare to a degree?
I think it's outstanding. I think it's great to say. And, I think one of the shocking things to Europe was when Washington, after his 2 terms, went away. That was right. That went against, I mean, it just blew them away, whether it was France, England, whatever. They just couldn't believe that this guy gave up the power.
Right.
And I think there's a lot, my perception of Napoleon is there still was a huge ego, statues of himself and so, and I just, I think it's a total different character of person.
Sure. Yeah.
Ambition and, so you're right.
And that's the fascinating thing about history is you take these different scenarios and then the figure that's in the position to make a decision or the position of power at the time, it kind of just shows you the different depths and the spectrum of decisions that can be made and the kind of man that or woman that a figure will end up being based on those decisions. You can say, what if George Washington grew up in Corsica and then, what if you put that character in the situation with Napoleon? What if you put Napoleon in this situation? But it's not, we got who we got. So it's, some men are great, some men have greatness thrust upon them is the case, or the famous saying. But then you just have different characteristics, different upbringings, different viewpoints on life, different cultures that come into it. So it's hard to make those parallels, but I do see that one there. So I thought it was interesting. That just kind of came to mind.
Yeah. Makes you
France is in a rough
America
spot.
And its founders, though. I know we've talked about that many times, just of not lucky, but I mean, just because it's not just Washington. I mean, obviously he's one of the greats, but it's just, and we've talked about this a couple of times before, Jesse and I have at least, but it's like, where were the other guys elsewhere in the world? Is it just America that seemingly had, Washington, Adams, Hancock, Franklin, Hamilton,
like, Jefferson?
I mean, it just goes on and on and on of these guys of high character. And yeah, they had their minor flaws and stuff or whatever, but I mean, brilliant. I mean, just men that are just irreplaceable in history.
Yeah, my favorite, I think I remember about John Adams, that book the most was, one of the reasons we have the book John Adams because of all the letters back and forth, right? They just kept them. And he had written a letter to his daughter, and I think he was in France at the time, and said, basically saying, when looking for a husband, there's nothing more important than integrity. And he went on to say several sentences. He goes, it doesn't matter about this or that or what they do for a living or whatever. It's about integrity. And so what he was passing on to his children really is what he stood for. Right. He wasn't going to be compromised. And that's, and I think that's why he really didn't do that well in France, because he had integrity.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even his fellow founders, even his fellow founders saw him as like bullish and, quick rigid to anger, which he was to a degree, really rigid. So yeah, it's an interesting culture clash between John Adams and the French during that part of his life.
Bribing, right? Would this be totally against,
Right. Okay, cool. So now we're in France. Things are looking rough. This is what Napoleon essentially shows up to: is a fractured economy, an unhappy populace, a country on the verge of war against three major powers in the world. And a quote from this time in a letter to Marmont from Napoleon was, "When the house is crumbling, is it a time to busy oneself in the garden? A change here is indispensable." So just kind of right before we get to the coup, it just kind of reinforces that Napoleon sees his moment and he is ready to seize it. Because I agree with you. I do think ego is a part of it. I do think, Napoleon had genuine desires for France and for it to be, this city on a hill, but there was that ego, and he didn't come home and just see his fellow countrymen and his economy in shambles. He saw an opportunity for Napoleon to rise, which consequently is the name of this part of the book.
I was getting excited when I was reading at this point. You kind of, the book's having some momentum. You're kind of waiting for this, right? You're kind of waiting.
Yep. Yeah, I was too. And so before we get to the coup, I didn't know anything about this, and I think there's a really cool parallel that I'll have to refer to Loach for in a moment here. But again, French just politics and the revolution, and then Napoleon's whole role in all of it was really unfamiliar to me. So going into it not knowing about the coup and like the details of it, I was very surprised at how this took place. I was expecting, a 1939 Berlin kind of scene where people get dragged out of houses and legislators and beheaded and all this stuff. And that is not what happened at all.
There was at least very minimal bloodshed, right? I mean, I don't remember there really being
I don't remember any. Yeah. On that first night, I don't think there was any.
He didn't take his political opposites and they disappear.
Right. No. Yeah. None of Vladimir Putin nonsense happened. None of that. Okay. So cool. So to get into the coup, of the many plots to overthrow the current government in France, Napoleon was the sword of Abbe Sieyès, is how I kind of said the name, or Sieyès. I don't know. This is one of the guys that ends up being one of the three consuls. But this guy wasn't a fan of Napoleon. And it even said that he should have been beheaded for his desertion of France, which is another factor that we haven't mentioned yet, is some people saw him as having deserted his army in Egypt because he left all of them back there. But either way, this Sieyès guy, had no choice but to use him after the process of elimination made him the best option. So here we are again. Napoleon becomes general through supply and demand, essentially. And although there were many plots to overthrow him, this Abbe guy had a pretty good one, seemingly. It's the one that works. And the way Roberts explains it is Napoleon was not the first option to be the quote-unquote sword of this coup d'etat. He had a few other options. Some of them were dead. Some of them were indisposed. One of them turned it down. So here we are again with just a happenstance in the history of humanity where a guy like Napoleon is the guy that ends up getting selected for this thing. I mean, I thought that was pretty wild to see that again. Right, perfect storm, as you've said. Right. So here we are to the coup then. November 1799, the coup takes place. 3 leaders of the Directory were rounded up and forced to resign. And then Napoleon took to the houses, first to the elders, where things went well enough, then to the 500, where he was ousted and almost physically harmed, allegedly. So this is where Napoleon's claims come from of him being, I mean, he goes from saying it was one guy that had a sword to 20 daggers being pointed at him. So he's definitely was a little melodramatic, I would say.
And one of the essentially assassins was named Brutus. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So essentially he just kind of walks in and it seems like, I mean, you gotta, the gall of this guy, you got to give it to him. I mean, he just walks into these legislative houses and is like, hey, this is not working. So I'm here to kind of take over things. And it doesn't work the way he planned. He almost gets outlawed as he's leaving. But luckily, after Napoleon gets out, they're able to get, I believe it's Lucien, his brother, out. If I remember correctly, it may have been someone else. They're able to get him out too, so that there can be no vote or official decision made on making Napoleon an outlaw, which again, kind of luck of the draw. He's lucky that didn't happen because they could have just turned him into an outlaw and then had the military turn against him if they had done that. So luckily for Napoleon, that didn't happen. So Napoleon then gathered his officers and soldiers and had them clear out the orangery of any non-supporters, after which were left around 50 deputies from the lower house. The Directory, along with both houses of legislature the Directory, along with both houses of the legislature and the Constitution of Year 3, were all abolished. This new body, as planned, elected the Sieyes guy, a guy named Ducasse, and Napoleon as provisional consuls until an interim commission could draw up a new constitution. Next thing I have is there was not really a notable reaction from the populace, and the event wasn't even referred to as a coup d'etat at the time. People were pretty much willing to see their government temporarily suspended for the gain promised by the likes of Napoleon. So that's the end of my notes. That's the coup. What do you guys have on the coup?
A couple things come to my mind. I think to the average French dude, it couldn't get any worse. Right? I mean, there was nothing to lose. I mean, it didn't affect the farmer in the field in the next village over or whatever. And the other thing is, this was a real dangerous time, I think, for France. You have these other monarchies that really don't like the idea of, there were still royalists out there. There were still people plotting to bring a royal back into power, especially, when you have the other empires that have kings and princes and stuff like that. There was just a real delicate, and I mean, there was nations waiting for that instability.
Right.
So it was they were watching that very closely, with what was going on. And there's no information moving around. I mean, basically, how did, when you have an uneducated populace? So really, I think this seemed to really only affect Paris, really.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. And I think what you just said just reminded me, there's no, either Napoleon destroyed it or he just didn't do it. There's really no personal communications that survive from this, like, I think a 10-day period, maybe a 15-day period that led up to the coup, which I thought was really interesting because it's another example kind of Napoleon's ego, but it seemingly, whether he destroyed it after the fact or just didn't involve himself in personal letters, either way, he saw, okay, this is a big moment in history and I am going to control the narrative, which is really all we have, is his narrative. And then I guess some different accounts that came out, which is why you get the obviously untrue 20 daggers pointed at me in the orangery comment. But anyway, I think you were about to say something as well, Andrew. Sorry.
Oh, no. I mean, yeah, it is, it's all, word of mouth at that time, I guess, which is, it's kind of incredible that he realizes that in the moment. And I don't know, I just feel like a lot of other people get so, not that he's not to his head, but like almost kind of undefeatable. And then they mess up, and then, which I know he probably has moments later on where that's going to occur, but anyway, it just seems pretty, he has some pretty good foresight to think of that, if it was planned out to not have any correspondence during this time.
Right.
I mean, there absolutely were people in the French government that stood out and said, this is wrong. He needs to be arrested. They just had no power.
Yeah.
Right.
They didn't have an army.
Even his brother
then
did something, right?
Even then, it was really that local militia, right? It really wasn't the army.
Right.
He was in conspiracy with the police guy.
It was just the 17th district, right?
And if that guy had turned on him, it would have been nothing.
Right. So what do you, to kind of speak to what you just said, like picturing this moment where he storms the orangery with his officers and soldiers and kicks everybody out, like just based on your knowledge of this time in the French Revolution and this coup, like what is the temperature and what is the mood in the room when this happens? Like, are people, because like it doesn't seem like a lot of people really fought back from what we know, and it doesn't seem like there were any bodies that washed up from this specific event. So it would seem like was it just a case of they've got guns and we don't, so it's over? Or, I mean, do you think they were unsurprised and maybe a little, resigned to it? Like, what do you think?
Well, I'm thinking that what it's hard for us to keep in mind, and they mentioned this in the book, is that it was still very raw to this populace about the guillotine and people losing their heads, the thousands of people that were killed. So there was people literally in government that had to respond to other people who ordered the death of their parents. I mean, there, people. I mean, you're working with a government that and you just basically have to get along. So I would think they're absolutely. To me, I'm just talking out loud. I don't have any. This is not from a historical truth that I've read. I just in thinking, knowing what had happened there, because I mean, help me out. How long of a time period was it from the last wave of killings, right, to when he took power? I mean, how long was this? 10 years, 6 years?
Yeah, I was thinking around the 10-year mark, I believe.
I mean,
from like the terror.
That means a 20-year-old remembers it clearly. At a 30-year-old, what happens if you stand out? What happens if you go against the grain? So I think there's a certain amount of compliance in the people. I mean, you just kind of take the temperature of the room. I'm using the word you used, the temperature. Well, it looks like we're going this way.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what the Roman armies would do, right? They would speculate who would win. And many times the Roman armies, when they fought each other, wouldn't even really actually fight. It would just kind of like, well, we think you got more people, so we'll kill our emperor and join yours. It's just kind of like they just kind of went with the mood.
Right. Which, if you're a common soldier in that situation, I'm thinking, thank God we don't have to fight. And it's helpful for everybody because you want to not lose as many of your army if you can. So if you can just engulf another one, I mean, yeah, it makes complete sense.
That's a
I was just kind of curious.
Books. That's funny.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah, there's a fantasy book, Nathan, that or series that I've read, and Jesse will eventually read it. It's very popular, but that's like one of the main themes. Like, there's a mercenary group, and it's found out that essentially they're doing what you're saying, where it's like, hey, like if you pay us a little bit more money, we'll come in and act like we're killing people, but we're really not. It's all, it was all a facade, like these armies, which I'm not saying that, that's how every army was. But I mean, people don't want to die. No one wants to die. So, it is funny. It's interesting to think, it's easy to see the Gladiator movies where it's like, this is Sparta, and think everyone's just willing to lay their life down. Whereas, not all of us are that brave. So it's just funny to think of the coercion behind scenes of like, all right, let's all kind of like a Survivor moment, and let's backdoor vote this guy out kind of thing.
Right.
Now, I wish I knew more about those exact circumstances around the coup. I mean, I'm saying, like you said, there's not a whole lot of information, just peripheral sources. I just thought one thing that was telling is that in this transfer of power, many criticized him for not taking action against the political enemies. He basically let them go out to pasture. And of course, that later came back. But
right. And that's a bit of a departure from not only the times, but specifically from what, as you just said, France was just going through in the prior decade. That's a big departure from kind of what the standard was when you're taking over the government and you're revolutionizing. So I think that's one of the And again, we've only read the first part of this book, so who knows what his future looks like. But at least at this point in Napoleon's life, it kind of attests to him not being this just outright brutal, cruel leader that just wants, like it seemed like he wanted as little blood as possible, and really everything leading up to this point when he could help it, including this moment.
And I mean, is it fair to say? Let me ask you guys this question: at this moment in time, would you perceive Napoleon as saying this? Now, this is I'm one step closer to being total in charge, or was it mainly I'm bringing effective change? In other words, was this really from all along? Did he want to be the supreme emperor, or did he really just want to make change because what was there was not working? We don't really know that.
Yeah, that's true.
That's a really, really good question, actually. And the perception that I guess I left with after finishing this part was that he was of two minds. I think again, like I said, I think there was a lot of truth to him wanting a better France and a better situation for the common people of France. But I do think there was, adhered right next to that, there was the egotistical, selfish desires, because, he pretty much forces they plan this in advance, and he makes it clear, I'm going to be one of the 3 people that's in this provisional government. And then, as without reading the book, he shortly comes into a much greater deal of power. So I think for me, and maybe this is a disembarking point for Napoleon, maybe he's not like this in the future, but it seemed like he had some good intentions there, and he masked maybe a lot of his personal, selfish desires to be in power with those philanthropic, maybe that's the wrong word, but philanthropic means of not killing people, not being brutal, and trying to just come into power and make a positive change. But so I would say I saw the 2 sides of Napoleon in that moment, just the way he handled it, and how he still wants to put himself kind of at the forefront. So I say all that to say I could see him going either direction from this point on, based on the information I have right now. Because I think they were both those factors.
I see him as someone who would almost respect too if he were to be outsmarted. Like he's almost smart enough to like appreciate. Whereas I feel like there's definitely other leaders that, I mean, not that he'd be happy about it, but I mean, I feel like it ends up attesting to the fact that he, not to jump ahead, but I mean, he gets exiled, not killed. So in the end, it probably ends up playing out to his benefit that he doesn't just come in guns blazing. Because, I mean, those type of people usually then don't make it out. And, he obviously ends up dying eventually, but, he gets exiled and not killed. Which that is, again, jumping ahead.
One thing we didn't talk about that I think was a constant theme of this first part of the book was his disdain for the bureaucracy. His disdain for the inefficiency of government. To him, it was just, I think he thought he could just do a better job than they were doing. I mean,
right.
Obviously, he had to delegate. Obviously, he made poor decisions, putting family in important roles or nepotism. But at the end of the day, I just think he just was tired of the BS. Because it's what you described, and when you were reading your quotes, it was quite a cumbersome, inefficient government.
Right. Yeah. And that would make complete sense too. Yeah. Was that kind of to answer your own question, was that kind of where you were after finishing part 1? You kind of saw, is that what you saw? You didn't necessarily see the would-be emperor or the other side of that. You kind of just saw what you said as far as him just being tired of the situation and wanting to change it.
Yeah. And y'all correct me if I'm wrong. Hadn't he almost kind of retired from military to a certain extent? I mean, or am I remembering it incorrectly? Because there really wasn't any active war at that point, or was it? Am I wrong?
They had threat of war from the British, Russian, Austrian alliance, but no, they weren't actively at war except for the people he had left back in Egypt who were still kind of trying to keep up with what he had taken, but they seem to have mostly failed. So no, I mean, outright war, I don't think so.
There's a saying, if we're all in a business deal and you don't know who the sucker is, you're the sucker. You know what I'm saying? If you don't know who the chump is, you're the chump. I'm pretty sure that he probably knew he was big dog of the 3.
Yeah, I think so. I think he had that in the bag and knew it. So that's where we are then.
He's a very likable guy, though, correct? I still think he's a likable guy.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Especially when you throw in the, and it's hard because, he knew that his letters were being, looked at, and he also probably understood for posterity reasons that some of his letters may be viewed later in life, because there's a lot of people in this era, the Jeffersons of this era, were always thinking about posterity and how they'd be viewed in the future. But that being said, based on some of his letters and the way he talked, and again, the way he treated like his men and the way he seemingly cared for the common people, yeah, he seemed like a likable guy. And if I dare say it, so far up to this point, for a guy that I perceived as like this, dictator, tyrannical guy, he seemed fairly reasonable so far in his campaigns. For all the ego and all the flaws that we've seen so far when it comes to his handling of these military situations, and in situations where he could have killed a lot more people, he came across as pretty reasonable to me.
Yeah, well, he eliminated the whole you lead because of your station in life. He totally basically, where you could buy a command, you could buy whatever position in the army with money and paying. He basically eliminated all that.
Right. And that's a respectable thing. Yeah. So that's it for part 1 as far as everything that happens. Part 2 is called Mastery. And I think this is a 5-part book. Is that correct, Nathan? Do you remember? I'm pretty sure it's 5, or do you know?
I think it's 3.
Oh, it's just 3? Okay. Either way, that's the end of the first part.
It's 33 hours on the audio, and that's all I know.
Okay. Well, it's, as far as the physical book, just to gauge, it's a 976-page book, which a lot of that's notes and resources, so probably more like, 800-ish, 790, somewhere around there. But either way, the first part only covers about 150 pages. So I imagine these next parts are going to be a lot more thick with information. But with all that being said, is there anything else from part 1, the rise to power in Napoleon's life, that you would add?
I just want to thank y'all for this opportunity. It's been a true joy and pleasure, and
yeah, man.
And I just, it's been a lot of fun. Absolutely a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. We've really enjoyed it. Also looking forward to continuing these videos as we catch up to you in this book. But I did want to mention for this podcast, I don't know if you remember this, Nathan, but do you remember that I was on the soccer team at Elka?
Absolutely, I do.
Do you happen to remember how many points I scored that season?
Well, the first season was brutal, right? I mean, just brutal.
Brutal. And that was the only season I played.
Yeah, and I had remembered that, and I talked to Andrew about that night. When we were coming down, I said, I'm pretty sure he was on my soccer team. Whatever. Well, goodness, the first goal was scored by Cole against Locust Grove. Mm-hmm. That's the first game we won. And
wow,
we could not.
That's a good memory.
Yeah. Well, I had Cole for 4 years, right? And it was the first time Eagles Landing Soccer had ever won. Elkhart Soccer had ever won a game.
Right.
I don't think we probably scored more than 5 goals the whole season. So please tell me how many you got.
Nathan, I got -1 goals. I scored a goal for the other team on accident. I was trying my best to defend and didn't get in front of the guy really. So as I'm trying to dribble the ball away from him, I kicked it right past Esma, our goalie. Oh. And I remember him looking up at me like, what the heck? Because I had basically kicked it in. And yeah, we didn't win that game, and I didn't win any gold for that performance. But I did enjoy my time on the soccer team. So good memories.
Well, that is good. It was a lot of fun for me. I got voted out by the alumni after 5 years
they didn't know it was good for him.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, well, that's fair too. Well, cool. Thank you again, Nathan, for being on here. We look forward to doing more of this with you, getting through Napoleon. So we'll keep you posted as we trek along. Andrew, anything else from you? Any tidbits or anything you didn't get to say about Napoleon?
No, enjoyed it. Excited for part 2. Hey, I think we're on to something good here. So.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I'll take, kind of the same level of notes throughout the book. So I'll kind of have these, and I'm enjoying it. So again, Nathan, thank you for your time.
Absolutely, guys, my pleasure.
Sweet. Well, that's it for It's Lit Book Reviews. We'll see you guys next time.
So I gotta do a microphone so I can look like y'all.
Exactly.
You look the part. Awesome. All right. Well, we'll see you guys next time.
All right. Y'all have a nice evening.